my dears, and welcome to another video. I have not done a debunking, unpacking popular science one in a while, so I figured it's time. Also, preventing need it. I am a white young person with light brown shoulder length curly hair. I'm sitting in front of a plain wall that has green leaves on it, and I'm wearing a red shirt that has squirrels. Because you never know when you need a squirrel shirt. Anyway, we're gonna begin this with a story. Imagine, if you will, a high school Sydney. Everybody around them is talking about whether they're an INFJ or an ENFP or whatever. And then they ask Sydney, "What are you?" And Sydney does not know. And so they are instructed to take this online personality quiz where all the questions are like, in this situation, do you do choice A or choice B? And Sydney starts to panic because actually that's not specific enough and it really depends on the situation and they cannot make a definitive binary choice, and this also should have been foreshadowing for their later gender crisis, but that's unrelated. But they manage to finish the test and they are given their type and everybody goes, oh, that makes so much sense. And then they feel included, I guess, but also a little bit stressed that maybe they did the test wrong, and so maybe that's actually not the group that they fit into. And then a few months later, they start to openly question whether or not they might be autistic because of a book they read in their 11th grade English class, and they're told by several people, you can't be autistic, you're just a classic Sagittarius INFJ who's sensitive and quirky and unique. And this is when their villain arc began. Now, this video is not going to be entirely anti-personality tests. They're not all bad. I don't viscerally hate them. And I think the fact that this concept has consistently existed for hundreds of years, at the very least, is something important about human nature. I'm not particularly bothered that these exist. I'm bothered by how they are misrepresented and advertised and utilized in, at minimum, sketchy and at maximum actively harmful ways, which we're going to get into today. Not to the degree of depth or certainty that I wanted, because most everything I read said effectively the same things and also had different dates as to when certain things were actually developed because they've all been published like 16 times. It's just a whole mess. Either way, I'm not going to let perfection be the enemy of good. So let's talk about personality tests. Now, the personality test as we know it today began in 1919 with the Woodworth Personal Data Sheet, the first supposedly objective analysis of personality. It was made for the US Army with about 100 questions to figure out what potential soldiers had high levels of neuroticism and would therefore be more susceptible to developing shell shock. The existence of this test led the military to cut significant funding toward finding treatment for shell shock and instead funding preventative measures like finding ways to not recruit soldiers who might develop it, which I think describes a lot about how the overall behavior of the US government functions. Anyway, moving on, the idea of a personality test increased in popularity after this time, particularly as the ideas of early psychology, particularly Freud and Jung, took off in the general population, which led to lots of people, academic and otherwise, making different personality tests for different reasons. Smaller quizzes also became very successful in ladies' magazines starting in the 50s, with the first regular quiz popping up in Ladies' Home Journal, but there is the occasional example from the 1930s and 1940s. And now, today, in 2024, we get make a personal bowl of pasta to be matched with your soul Taylor Swift song BuzzFeed quizzes. How far we have come. Though personally, I think that it is a major upgrade from how good a parent are you and am I a career woman from 1936 and 1947 respectively, because those feel a little bit more shame-oriented, and this one is just simply pasta-oriented. One very famous personality test is the Myers-Briggs Type Indicator, which is the one that I used in the story with which we began this video if you didn't recognize it. And no, before you ask, I don't actually remember what my type is, and I know that I've gotten a very different result every time I've taken the test, which has been about 3 or 4 times maybe. I always get stuck just right at the beginning as to whether I'm an introvert or an extrovert, and then everything just kind of falls apart from there. I know that there's the stereotype that autistic people see everything in black and white, but I am very much the kind of autistic who sees everything in such gray detail that I get overwhelmed by all the different shades of it, and then I just back away slowly until I'm far enough to run in the opposite direction, and any multiple choice question about how I handle a situation isn't hyper-specific, which they never are, makes me run even faster. In fact, my fundamental inability to fill out those "do you do this thing always, often, sometimes, occasionally, or never" intake questionnaires should have been the first diagnostic clue. But back to the Myers-Briggs, or the MBTI. This test was developed during World War II by Catherine Briggs and her daughter Isabel Myers. They were both non-scientists who really liked the work of Carl Jung and wanted to help the war effort, so they created a questionnaire based on Jung's 3 personality types, plus another one that they decided to add for some reason, to help people find what kind of job was best suited for them so that they could help the war effort. The first version of this questionnaire was published in 1943. It divides people into one of 16 categories across binary options in 4 different groups: introversion and extroversion, sensing and intuition, thinking and feeling, and judging and perceiving. So if I were an INFJ, which is a random example I picked earlier because it sounds the most familiar to me, that would mean that I am an introvert who prefers to take in information via intuition, which means I like ideas for the sake of ideas, and I like non-literal things. I make decisions via feeling rather than thinking, and I like to live my life via judging rather than perceiving, which means that I really like making plans and having matters settled. An INFJ is idealistic, organized, insightful, dependable, compassionate, gentle. They seek harmony and cooperation, enjoy intellectual stimulation. And you might say, okay, but Sunita kind of really describes you. But also, interestingly enough, the exact inverse of the INFJ is the ESTP, which is outgoing, realistic, action-oriented, curious, versatile, spontaneous, pragmatic problem solvers, and skillful negotiators, which also really describes me really well. Wild how that happens! Another personality test is the DISC assessment, which was first published in 1928 by William Moulton Marston, the man who also brought us the polygraph test and Wonder Woman. I don't know, man. The first assessment based on his DISC theory was published in 1956 by Walter Clark. This assessment divides people into 4 groups: dominance, D-style or green; inducement, influence, I-style or red; submission, steadiness, S-style or blue; and compliance, conscientious, C-style or yellow. Marston believed that everyone had little pieces of all of these inside of them, but they have a primary style that they look at the world with. And Clark's assessment then sorts you into one of these 4 primary styles. According to their website, a D-style person places emphasis on accomplishing results and seeing the big picture. They are confident, sometimes blunt, outspoken, and demanding. An I-style person places emphasis on influencing or persuading others. They tend to be enthusiastic, optimistic, open, trusting, and energetic. An S-style person places emphasis on cooperation, sincerity, loyalty, and dependability. They tend to have calm, deliberate dispositions, and they don't like to be rushed. And a C-style person places emphasis on quality and accuracy, expertise, and competency. They enjoy their independence, demand the details, and often fear being wrong. Now, as far as I can tell, the MBTI and the DISC are the 2 most commonly used personality assessments in workplace settings. We'll get back to that shortly. First, I want to bring up 2 others. The first is the Enneagram, which divides people into one of 9 types: the reformer, the helper, the achiever, the individualist, the investigator, the loyalist, the enthusiast, the challenger, and the peacemaker. The origins of this one are super unclear, mostly because it sort of advertises itself as like ancient South American teachings, but at the same time derived from the spiritual teachings of a guy in the 1950s. So that's weird. The second is the Big 5, or Ocean, which measures along 5 traits: openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. But rather than give you a type by the end of it, it simply scores you for each trait along a continuum. This one was developed in the 50s and 60s by university students who made it by taking every single possible word that could be considered a personality trait and then asking a ton of people questions about it via a survey. They then took those results to figure out what things generally clustered together, and that's how they created their categories. In 2000, there was a new model created called Hexaco, which is the Big 5 plus a 6th trait, honesty and humility. Now, the first thing to note about all of these in regards to both reliability and validity is that personality as a concept is not a solid or agreed upon thing. So every single one of these groupings is going to be inherently biased based on the creator's opinions of what personality is and how people come to be the way that they are and behave the way that they do. They cannot claim to be an objective measure because the thing that they are attempting to measure is not objective, in the same way that like the SAT and the ACT don't actually measure intelligence, and also in the same way that scoring on the SAT or ACT somewhat correlates with somebody's college success, but schools are increasingly realizing that said correlation may not be direct, may be based on other factors, and that standardized testing widens the achievement gap for minority students because of how it is structured and what it is based on ideologically, which is why schools are increasingly not requiring test scores for applications. The issue of using personality tests in work settings and hiring processes is a very similar conversation right now. Another thing to note is the fact that personality tests are taking something very, very complicated and messy and nuanced and trying to explain it as an objective either-or situation, which doesn't make a whole lot of sense. One article that I read, and forgive me for forgetting which one, described it as if instead of measuring height, we just decided that people are tall or they are short, which is relative, arbitrary, and also very frequently changes over time. The third thing to note, and then we are going to get into specific discussions of specific assessments, is the fact that these tests are fundamentally based on self-reporting, which means the person taking them needs to be self-aware enough of how they are to get an accurate result. It also means that a person could actively lie, either deliberately because they want a certain result, especially this is for a job application, or accidentally because they feel like they are one way when in reality they are another. And there's kind of this idea that a personality test will reveal the true you that's hidden inside, but in reality it takes all the information and all the biases and opinions about yourself that you give it, and then it rewords those into something else that it hands right back to you, which can be both a very positive and a very negative thing. We're going to get to that as well. Now, when you research the issue with personality tests, the first one to come up is always the MBTI, primarily because it makes an estimated $20 million a year because it charges anywhere from $15 to $40 to take the quiz, and also it sells itself to major companies to use in hiring, training, and managing employees. Of course, the company themselves say that the test is reliable and valid, but they very rarely share the direct numbers as to what they mean by that, and any data they do share are from research funded by the foundation, which is obviously a red flag. Non-foundation research has found that 50% of people will get a different type if they retake the test a month after initially taking it. Statistical analyses have pretty much disproven all actual reliability and validity. There has been extensive discussion about how confusing and poorly worded many of the questions are, which also is going to impact result quality. How there is no such binary dichotomy, and therefore questioning it or measuring within it makes no sense, and specifically the neuroticism measure is not properly analyzed for within this test. There's also little to no evidence of these profiles as being significantly helpful in predicting how a team will work together or how people will interact with each other. And there have been critiques about how this measure is this trait that causes active harm is actually just a difference you should embrace, which is complicated and nuanced, but also a thing to note. I couldn't find a lot of critique about DISC individually. It was always in conversation with, here's why the MBTI is debunked and largely unhelpful in the workplace. DISC is also equally unhelpful and unreliable for much of the same reasons, but with a lot more individual horror stories about DISC being used terribly in workplaces, because this one is used more widely, so that's kind of all I have for that. Enneagrams are generally agreed upon as being complete pseudoscience. I honestly couldn't find anything from professionals even remotely trying to defend them beyond their own website. Most discussions around scientific validity and reliability hold up the Big Five personality assessment as the poster child. And in fact, many other personality assessments will hold it up and kind of hide behind it, try to bolster their own credibility. The Big Five is the one personality test that actually does work. This is the one that has decades of research to back it up, and it understands personality the best, particularly because of the continuum situation rather than it being like an individually labeled profile. But a 2019 study titled Challenges to Capture the Big Five Personality Traits in Non-Weird Populations, weird stands for Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic, brought this also into question. Because when they did this test across 23 non-weird countries, it was neither accurate nor effective. People's results changed based on which interviewer they were talking to. They would change based on the day. The typical clusters of traits seen in results were not clustered the same, and just overall seemed to be a much less valid measure of personality. Some discussions around this have suggested this may be because of cultural differences and that different cultures prioritize different things. Educational differences, many of the people they talked to did not have high school or college educations, and also linguistic differences, both in the translation of this test and also the fact that the test is based on a very English-specific and culturally English-specific linguistic understanding of personality, which is just different in different languages and different cultures. It also may just be that this study has been tested on a very specific portion of the population, and its scientific validity may be true just on a very small portion of the population. It also seems like this measure may not be as reliable or valid for older populations in Western countries as well. This data is a little bit less clear, but that is also coming to the surface lately. So then, if we know all of these things, why do personality tests still stick around? And the main overarching reason is that humans like to feel like we have complicated things figured out so that we feel like we have control over those things. And we can trace this all the way back to the ancient Greek idea of the four humors and how an excess of one or another could make you temperamental in certain specific ways. And these things are also written in a way to be accessible to the general population while also sounding scientific and official. Part of why Freud's theories caught on so quickly is because he wrote them in a way that a layperson could learn about them and go, oh yeah, that totally makes sense, and feel really smart for understanding scientific concepts. There's a reason people really like pop psychology in general, but also personality tests specifically are fun. They walk the line between science and just playing a game. And of course, people are going to want to play if there's a game that makes them feel smart. We always want to feel like we're more self-aware and understand ourselves better, particularly if we think that thing is going to help us. We've talked about the myth of learning styles on this channel before. I'll link that above over here. Which function like a personality test effectively, and at the end of it they tell you how you learn and how to cater your learning to your needs. Is that based on any actual scientific research? No. But hey, it's fun to take quizzes and we think it's gonna help, and so therefore we feel like it does, when it actually directly impedes our ability to learn because we end up becoming more closed-minded about the other things that don't align with that learning style. In the case of personality tests, particularly DISC and MBTI, we have been taught that they help us. We feel like because we know ourselves better, we will be better at conflict resolution and faster at it because we're all using the same language around that, when actually most issues are systemic things rather than individual communication or functioning issues. And also the differences being pointed out by these are more or less arbitrary and situational, and by emphasizing these differences for people, they're less likely to be flexible in complicated situations to make things actually work more smoothly. We get into this mindset of, oh, we're not compatible because you're yellow and I'm green, rather than this conversation isn't working because you're being told from a higher up you need to get the answer immediately, and I know from doing my job that I can't get you that answer right now, which is actually going to be a whole lot more helpful. We have this idea that if we all use the same language around a concept, we're going to fix the pieces where things don't line up, when that's actually only part of the problem. First of all, because the understanding of that language may not actually be standardized. Like, I may think that telling somebody I'm autistic is a linguistic shortcut to explain why I am the way I am and how to work with me better, but somebody else's interpretation of what autistic means might be completely different, and actually we've created a new tension that wouldn't be there had I not disclosed my disability, or had I just said I'm neurodivergent more generally and left it at that. And obviously that's clouded by lived experience and social stigma of that label, which none of these personality tests really have societally. And also mental disability labels are more statistically sound than any personality test is by far, but somebody who has been in a company that uses a personality test for 9 years and has consistently had a hard time with ISTPs might feel a certain way about the next ISTP they meet that creates a hostility that wouldn't otherwise be there. And either way, whether they know about somebody's MBTI profile or somebody's neurotype, I guarantee you that any issues or tensions are actually going to be around the fact that one person doesn't really do their job, one person does their job wrong and everybody else has to clean up after them, and the parent company keeps cutting costs, and also there's structural racism and ableism in the company, the ethics of the company are sketchy, the quality of life in the workplace is weird, and the things that happen with natural human variance when they all come together in a workplace because group projects are always pretty darn messy and never really go that well, are all still going to be the main problems. And one idea that I saw come up a few times in various places is the fact that personality tests are often used in workplaces specifically as a capitalistic shortcut to getting to know each other. It feels more scientific and official, and therefore a better use of time and energy to have everybody take a personality test and then do a few exercises on how to interact with different kinds of personalities than it does to say, have a pizza party, or do something where people are just hanging out. It also feels more scientific and official to use these in your hiring processes as something objective, as a fallback, so you can blame something else if a new hire doesn't work out, or as an easy way to weed out applications when you have thousands coming in every day. Personality tests feel good. They feel like they're giving you scientific backing for being normal in the way that you are. You feel like you're special and unique and you're part of a specific group, and the fact that you don't fit in sometimes is actually because you're one way and these people are another way. And also, for the ones marketing themselves as completely unserious, like a BuzzFeed quiz, at the end of the day, they're a fun time. And this understanding can be positive. It can make you more confident in what makes you different and also more aware of where you struggle and how you want to do something about that, or how to find people like you. But it can also limit a person and be a reason that somebody uses to justify bad behavior and an unwillingness to change as a person or see how they interact with the world more holistically. Which is a tricky conversation because many of these critiques of the harm of personality tests are the same arguments people tell me when I talk about how I'm openly trans and queer and disabled. And so I almost hesitate to talk about these things here because I can already feel like the hate comments of like, you're critiquing this one thing people like for their identity and you're doing the same thing with X, Y, and Z identity. And I can't entirely disagree with that because while those identities are more evidence-based than a personality test might be by far, there are many new things popping up in the disability world and the queer world that are not yet scientifically discussed because that's just how things happen, and those are just as valuable and valid. But we do also have conversations around micro-labeling every single thing in those communities, and at what point does finding new labels defeat the purpose of having them in the first place, because it fulfills the identity portion, but it completely negates the easy shorthand communication piece. And also, personality assessments are a lot less like neurotypes and sexualities and a lot more like Hogwarts houses, so they're not even really comparable situations. But generally, what it comes down to for me is that if something helps you to find language for what you're experiencing and helps you to find the guidance you need to accept yourself for who you are and to understand yourself, but also at the same time have a constant growth mindset in a way that does not harm yourself or other people around you, go for it. I'm not going to say I'm not going to judge because I definitely have in the past, but I'm going to actively work harder to undo that thinking and judge a little bit less, because we all have our things that help us get through the day that other people may think are silly, and we should be allowed to have those things. Where it becomes an issue is when it creates active harm, which very much includes giant companies forcing these ideas onto people and forcing people to find and use these labels for themselves that they may not connect with. One huge difference between the disabled or queer conversation and the personality test conversation is that the first two are things you typically figure out on your own, and you are never legally required to disclose in a workplace setting. A personality test is something that often goes on or along with a job application. It is something where you're being asked to be vulnerable about something, placing you in a category based on those vulnerabilities, and then asking you to interact with the world and have decisions made for you via that thing. Also, these tests are generally pretty vague in the way that a fortune cookie or a horoscope might be, so that everybody relates to the majority of it, so it feels like it's true and it works. But what if you get something that you disagree with, something that isn't how you think of yourself, but now everybody else in your workplace is judging you by that metric? That's not going to feel very great, and that's going to make you question your sense of self. Also, how somebody interacts with the workplace is probably quite different from how they may interact with the world in general. If I'm applying for a research position, I'm going to show very different qualities than I am if I'm auditioning for a musical, for example. So using these things in hiring is an issue on that front, where it decides what you are and are not good at based on an unproven metric, and then decides what job or promotion you may or may not get, rather than your actual work experience, work ethic, skill set, who you are as a person, etc. Which you'd think isn't that frequent, but the amount of horror stories that I read about this while researching was actually infuriating. One particular article I would recommend for these if you want to read more is by The Swaddle. It's titled Myers-Briggs Test Has Been Debunked Time and Again, Why Do Companies Still Use It? If you want to learn more about this. It's not just that in a pile of 1,000 applications a bunch are thrown out because of a personality test result, but also that when it comes down to two different people for a big promotion, these tests are often used to decide which one of the two gets it. There's also more recent discussion around liability for companies who use these in job applications, because the traits that are generally seen as positive or desirable in certain positions are based on a very specific metric, one that was created by white, non-disabled people. And particularly with disability rights law, there is a significant question as to how these tests might, in and of themselves, disclose people's disabilities before they're hired for the job, which is point-blank hiring discrimination. Also, the metrics it sees as successful in a workplace are based on correlations that are not super solid nor significant enough to really hinge a hiring decision on, especially because it discriminates against certain groups of traits related to various minority groups. Again, a very similar situation to the SAT. There's also the dangers around overconfidence and fixed mindset. If we put all this money and all this time and work into using this system, it therefore must work and it must be the truth about everybody and we must have solved all the problems. When obviously, seeing something super non-objective as objective can cause serious issues. Again, going back to the, oh, we're just incompatible so we can't fix it scenarios, or being convinced that this person will never be good at this specific skill, so we're not going to let them learn it or expand their horizons. We're not going to give them that promotion which will include a skill they scored low on. We're going to give it to somebody else who's less qualified but scored higher. Replacing a probably already existing bias with a different, supposedly more objective bias does not actually get rid of bias, it just makes you more confident in the previous bias with a way to justify it. And I'm looking precisely at every single person who goes, it's not autism, it's this personality type plus the zodiac sign, which is only furthering ableist rhetoric and making it harder for people to get accommodations, and it drives me up the actual wall. Disability, by the way, not a bad word. Use it, it's helpful. The last danger that I didn't know about until I started researching for this, which I should have, I don't know why this was shocking to me, is the fact that many online personality tests are farming data, which makes sense. I truly don't know why I didn't put that together until now, but obviously us putting in this information about us and how we see the world, and then often people sharing those things openly, says things about us. In 2008, researchers David Stillwell and Michael Kosinski created a small personality quiz on Facebook for a study that tons of people took, and they posted their results to, and then some of them gave permission for these researchers to look at their Facebook activity at the same time. And they, based on analyzing Facebook likes alone, could guess how people think, feel, and act. That messy web of tendencies and habits with startling accuracy. With 70 likes, the model could predict someone's personality as measured by a 100-question personality test better than that person's friends could. With 300 likes, it could outperform a husband or wife. So first of all, at what point is our algorithm its own personality test? But also, what can be done negatively with this information? Targeted ads for products, targeted ads for ideas, the fact that Cambridge Analytica effectively used the results of that 2008 study to do everything that they did. And it could be used for positive things as well, like helping to better inform people, but obviously that's a double-edged sword because who's controlling the information that we think is being better informed? Obviously, specific customer targeting things are not new, they've been around for a very long time, but they are getting more precise as time goes on. One particular quote about the dangers of this that stuck out to me was, "That's where the impulse to take a personality quiz keeps me up at night. I'm wired to seek out ways to reflect on who I am, but who I am is slippery, and that makes me open to suggestions. If people's faith in algorithms continues to grow, it might not be long before I trust a computer to tell me about my personality more than I trust friends or family family, or more than I trust myself. Yay, dystopia! But in an effort to wrap all this up, it seems like we've come to the same answer that we do every time I make one of these analyzing pop science videos, which is that critical thinking is really important, as is media literacy, which is a subsection of critical thinking. All tools can be used for good things, and also for not good things, which requires us asking questions about why those things exist, and what purpose they serve, or what purpose they may claim to serve. Again, I don't think there's anything inherently wrong with reading through the language of these tests because it might help give you some language to understand your experience or start to be aware of and question things about why you do certain things or behave in certain ways over other things, which encourages awareness and reflection and growth. I mean, the best personality test is one that simply works as a mirror so you can see yourself more clearly. In the same way that teachers assign self-assessments a lot. It can make you conscious of things you may not be thinking about as deliberately, things that aren't quite on your radar. But most notably, it's not the results that do that, it's usually the questions of the assessment themselves. What personality tests aren't is a shortcut to human interaction, or a definitive answer as to who you are and who you will always be, because they don't really have the ability to measure that. So if you see a company that requires you to take one of these to apply for the job, maybe think twice about it, because it says a lot about their company culture. And for yourself, just be aware of why you're using these tools, what draws you to these tools, and what biases may be coming through these tools that you might be perpetuating, both about yourself and about other people. Because reflecting on that is just as important as reflecting on whatever you see in your results. Also, speaking of results, while I did make a I will not take any personality test rule for this video, based on my bowl of pasta, BuzzFeed told me my Soul Taylor Swift song is You're on Your Own Kid, saying I, quote, act tough and unbothered, but deep down I want to be cared for. I'm very protective of my loved ones and would do anything to see them happy. Which tracks, I guess, though the fact that I've never heard of the song until I got my result from a pasta quiz does make me question it a little bit as to whether that's really truly my Soul Taylor Swift song. But I guess we'll never know. What I do know is that now I really want to go eat pasta. Anyway, I'm gonna drop the link to that quiz in the description below to make up for how weirdly bleak this video managed to become. Let me know what song you got in the comments. All other sources are down there as well if you want to read more about the stuff yourself. If you want more debunked pop science things, I have a playlist which I will link down below and above for you. And as always, thank you for listening, thank you for learning. Remember, it's never too late to start over, and critical thinking is really sexy. I look forward to seeing you, my dear, in the next one.